As if things weren't stressful enough right now, China is currently conducting one of its largest naval exercises ever just off Taiwan. The war game is a response to the first overseas trip of Taiwan's new president. Why such a seemingly innocuous trip has provoked this crisis is the subject of today's show. I talked to the eminent Sinologist Kerry Brown about his new book, The Taiwan Story. It explains the history behind the dispute between China, Taiwan, and the United States, and suggests ways we can avoid it turning into outright war. The consequences of such a war, Professor Brown argues, would be several magnitudes worse than either Gaza or Ukraine. Will things worsen with Trump's return? Or will he and Xi Xinping surprise us all with a diplomatic deal? Kerry and I also discuss his time as a diplomat in the Far East, what it was like teaching in China in the 1990s, and we touch on whether Xi Jinping is really as handsome as Donald Trump claims. I hope you enjoy our talk. Professor Brown, thank you very much for sparing the time this morning.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
So I'm going to start with my Proustian / Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. What is your favourite word?
Oh, my favourite word. At the moment, probably reciprocity, because it took me years to learn how to say it properly.
What is your least favourite word?
Oh, gosh. Contention, because I have to deal with a lot of it.
Academically or internationally?
Academically. Well, I mean, in the general existential sense too, with the world as it is. But I deal with, obviously, an issue which sometimes divides people. So, yeah, it creates some contention.
What is your favourite swear word?
Well, that's a bit like, when did I stop beating my partner or something, isn't it? Let me say damn.
I mean, my follow-up was going to be, has anything about the Taiwan situation prompted you to use it?
Well, no. On these sorts of issues where I'm well schooled, I tend to be more kind of balanced. But I think politics elsewhere can certainly make me use that word, yeah, particularly in Britain.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
What is the what? The
sound or noise that you love.
Oh, the dawn chorus. I was thinking the other day that I haven't heard the dawn chorus for a long time, and I always used to love waking up and hearing the dawn chorus.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
The sort of scratching sound, like nails across a board or something like that. It makes me absolutely go on edge, yeah.
What is your favourite book?
My favourite book, I suppose, is Great Expectations by Dickens. I've read it many, many times, and I always really thought it was the perfect novel.
Do you have a favourite book about China?
Yeah, it's a sort of strange book by Rem Koolhaas, an architect, called Great Leap Forward from about 25 years ago, which was really, really innovative and imaginative for me, but not by a sinologist, which speaks volumes, I guess.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you like to imagine yourself being?
I think we all want to be Hamlet, don't we?
Hamlet?
Hamlet, yes. The Renaissance tortured genius, right? Well, without the murder. Obviously without the murdering, but, Hamlet without the murdering.
So you taught in China in the 1990s?
Indeed, yeah.
I'm curious, what drew you to the country? What was the experience like?
It was accidental. So I did English literature at Cambridge, and I didn't have any real connection with China, although I kind of thought about going there, but it was 1989, the Tiananmen Square uprising had happened. It wasn't really possible. So I went as part of a sort of exchange scheme to Japan, the JET scheme, which still runs, very successful. And while in Japan, I taught at the school there, but then I went to China just for, I think, a week to Beijing, and thought, wow, I should really be here. This seems much more familiar to me, And so I went back in 94 for voluntary service overseas as a teacher. I don't think they run those kinds of schemes anymore, and stayed for 2 years. And that's when I really learnt to live in the place, to know the place, to speak the language. And from there, it's really been part of my life.
One of my sort of favourite shows that I watch back and back is it's Michael Palin's Around the World in 80 Days. And there's a particular bit where he's in China at sort of late 80s. And it was sort of weird watching it because it seems like so a time past, but also a time really close. And so I'm curious about what it was like in that period, China.
It was very different. I mean, I think it was a little caught between two worlds, so it was still a little bit reminiscent of what I believe it was like in the Maoist period. You know, you could still understand the work unit system, a lot of controls in life, but a lot of kind of liberation too and liberalism. So it was sort of quite scrappy. You kind of found some areas were very ordered and controlled, and others absolute anarchy. And it was an interesting time to really travel around China. I think from the 2000s, China became a much more modernized, developed place. And I mean, today it's kind of like traveling around the first world in a way, or the developed world. I mean, much of China is very, very developed, maybe more developed than the West in some ways with its transport. So the 90s was the sort of the final period when you could still get the haunting sort of attachment to Mao and, you know, the world that he had run.
Why did you decide to sort of transition from teaching to becoming a diplomat?
Well, again, accident. I mean, I taught. I'm not a trained teacher. I mean, I never trained to teach in Britain, and so I became a business person for a couple of years before going into the diplomatic service. And the diplomatic service again was an accident, but I mean, it was. I didn't enter it after university. I went in later. I mean, in about early 30s. And, you know, kind of was part of a group that was really sort of had already experienced living in other parts of the world. And so, you know, that was kind of regarded as helpful for trying to do diplomacy. And I was a diplomat for, 7 years. So long enough to know what it was about, but really not long enough to say that I truly kind of rose up the system.
No. How was it sort of maneuvering those years of sort of the early noughties in diplomacy in the Far East?
Yeah, I mean, it was just after the handback of Hong Kong, so that was a sort of epoch-making kind of moment, and created a new sort of paradigm. When I joined the Foreign Office, I went to the China section, and they were dealing with the visit of the Chinese President Jiang Zemin to Britain, so it was really interesting. That's the first ever state visit by the top level Chinese leaders to Britain. I then went to Beijing for 3.5 years and served there when China entered the World Trade Organization. So that was also an incredibly important moment, but also the terrorist attacks on America, that had a big impact. And then for my final couple of years, I was dealing with Indonesia, East Timor and Philippines back in London. So it was quite varied. But I think as a diplomat, of course, you're constrained a lot by what you need to do to implement government policy. And a lot of government policy about these areas at the time was really, well, let's just try and do trade, let's just try and create pragmatic links. Had some successes, but obviously a lot of frustrations.
I mean, at the moment, there seems to be a sort of back and forth in terms of policy level, where there was a sort of move towards getting closer to China, especially on trade, then a sort of reaction, and now Sunak and then Starmer have seemed to be overseeing a move back to the sort of practical trade aspect.
Yeah, I mean, towards China, attention sort of comes and goes. I mean, for the last few years, it's been pretty tetchy. You know, it's been more about trying to focus on Hong Kong. I mean, a small group of MPs, and it's usually MPs that are the most sort of significant, can really kind of take this particular area of policy and have a big impact. And so there were, you know, quite a small group of MPs in Parliament, but they were very focused on China being sort of this massive problem. So they had, I think, a bit of a distorting impact. I'm not denying China isn't a challenging partner. I mean, it's a hard, you know, country to negotiate with. It's really difficult to sort of, you know, pursue a coherent foreign policy because there's so many limits to what you can really do to change the Chinese approach. But you still have to kind of be pragmatic. You don't really have the option of walking away. Either you deal with China as it is, or, I mean, there is no other option, right? So that's all I've, really kind of focused on. People can get very pious and on their kind of sort of soapboxes about this, and I know sort of one, particularly unpleasant sort of lobbying group in Britain that produces these nasty sort of, exposés, these fake exposés of those trying to study China. I mean, they kind of got very exercised by something I put up where the headline was, we should stop moralizing about China. In fact, I didn't say we should stop moralizing about China. I said we should be consistent in how we behave and how we speak. Saying one thing and doing another is a big problem. But I mean, I think that kind of cheap approach of, sort of saying people are kind of doing down the West, it's just not true. We have really given China a complicated message about who we are and what we are in the last few years. And I think if we don't act according to what we say our values are, it's hard for others to take us seriously.
Something you repeatedly warn about in the Taiwan story is the stakes of the conflict over the island. There isn't only sort of the terrifying prospect of war between two nuclear powers, but also, just as we're recovering from COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the impact on the world economy would be sort of several times worse than those. I just wondered if you could give an overview of the situation between China, Taiwan, and the United States.
Sure. I mean, China says that Taiwan is part of China and has always been part of China, as the book sets out. I mean, that's contentious, to use that word, at least, and probably not historically really that valid. Taiwan says, in fact, as a democracy, as a place where more and more people say that they're Taiwanese rather than Taiwanese Chinese, they feel separate. Most people from surveys show that they don't want any kind of reunification. So, very separate identity. And the United States is a sort of security guarantor for Taiwan that doesn't formally, diplomatically recognize Taiwan. It recognizes the People's Republic of China. So you can see why this is a complicated mix, because all the three partners, and two of them, China and America, are extremely powerful global entities. They don't align at all. So at the moment we have, this framework of sort of saying that there is one China, but leave resolution of anything until all parties agree, which might be tomorrow, might be never. But that's the way that we've handled this complex situation, at least from the 1970s till today.
I mean, something I found interesting is you make the point that it wasn't so much design as by accident, but this sort of developing idea of making Taiwan so instrumental to the world economy that it would be sort of catastrophic to China to invade, but also makes it a more tempting prize to rejoin with the mainland?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extremely paradoxical situation, because the more that Taiwan becomes Taiwanese, the less happy China is. However, the more difficult it is then to try and reclaim Taiwan, reclaim in sort of air quotes. I mean, that's what China says it wants, but obviously a lot of people don't recognize that. And therefore, the more dangerous the situation becomes. I mean, China's quandary is, of course, in just leaving things, it lets things slowly, incrementally slip away, and it's very aware of that. So it's constantly, rhetorically and in other ways trying to put pressure on Taiwan. But the fact is that since 1949, at least Taiwan's links with the, continental China, if we want to call it that, have been not really existed. I mean, so it's kind of this, as I said in the book, accident, but it's a pretty formidable accident that we're in this situation. While the current situation is extremely frustrating and irritating to almost everyone, all the other options are even worse. So this is, to use that word earlier, a pragmatist kind of pitch, as it were. This is not something that I think we can go for resolution, at least not today. Maybe never, but, not today. We definitely can't resolve this today.
I mean, something else that surprised me in the book was, given that the conflict was sort of created out of the Chinese Civil War and the contest between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, how vociferously the Chinese government has opposed attempts by Taiwan to sort of brush out Chiang Kai-shek from its history. It's almost like Beijing, it's preferable to maintain the fiction that there's still two players fighting over one China, as opposed to the reality of Taiwan being its own place and sort of making peace with that.
Indeed. The weird thing is, though, that in recent years, Chiang Kai-shek has had a bit of a comeback in China. He's more regarded as a sort of nationalistic hero now, mostly because the political party that's in power in Taiwan at the moment, the Democratic Progress Party, or Progressive Party, DPP, is regarded as historically a more independent supporting, more separatist party. It wasn't Chiang Kai-shek's party, his was the nationalist. So at least the nationalists thought that there was one China and believed in reunification, even if it was reunification that they were in charge of. The DPP believe in no such thing. So, kind of Chiang Kai-shek's standing has improved. Even so, I mean, the kind of lengths to which China will go to not recognize any kind of status for Taiwan these days is quite a lot. I mean, it just doesn't want Taiwan to have any international standing, any kind of real profile. And that also tends to lead to precisely the outcome that it's sort of meant to stop, where American politicians now are even more exercised by demonstrating symbolic support for Taiwan because of what China does. And that, again, creates only problems of escalation, as you've got more adventurism and more Americans really wanting to stick it to China. So Taiwan is a great way to do that. But, I mean, it's pretty dangerous, as my book sets out. It's pretty dangerous to do it.
I don't know if there is already, but I imagine there would be a great comedic film out of the situation of sort of the nationalist government maintaining a whole alternative government to a China who has no way to govern.
Yeah, so a few years ago, about a decade ago, there were a couple of American comedians who did do a skit on, well, what is Taiwan? And it ended up very, very comical because, okay, so this place is China, but it's not China, and it's part of this thing called One China, but it's separate from it. And what exactly is Taiwan? I mean, it's the Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China says that the Republic of China ceased to exist in 1949, and the Republic of China says the People's Republic of China never existed. And the whole thing is, kind of ripe for these sorts of clever word games. But the word games have at least avoided the thing that all of us want to avoid, which is an actual conflict. I mean, what's the difference between, Russia, Ukraine, and Israel and Gaza, and, China and Taiwan? Well, there's not blood being shed at the moment. Well, long may that continue. But also, if we were to come to that moment, it would not be like these conflicts. I mean, it would be significantly worse. And those conflicts are bad enough. So we don't have to use much imagination to see why we want to avoid this ever getting into an actual physical conflict.
I mean, to that point, another recurring thing in your book is that whatever the rhetoric about either a closer relationship with China or Taiwan declaring independence, most Taiwanese sort of prefer something in the middle. You make the point that they don't want their government to needlessly provoke China, but they also wanted to stand up to any intimidation or threats to the island's interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think Taiwanese in surveys, on the whole, are very prudent. They don't like leaders who are provocative because they know the dangers of that. So they support status quo because so far status quo has worked, which is not to say that they are at all happy with the treatment that they get by China. I mean, I think, again, as I say in the book, it's really belittling and humiliating a lot of the time for them to, not be allowed to international meetings for health or aviation, these sorts of things. But they accept that at the moment there's no resolution that China would accept that wouldn't cause them a big sacrifice that they do not and don't have to make. But also there's nothing they can do that would stop that without creating a very likely kind of pathway towards absolute conflict. So they sit at the front line and their views really matter, and their views largely show that they are pragmatic. They want status quo. They don't see a resolution to this issue, but they don't want reunification, definitely don't want reunification. And some of them don't even believe there ever was a unity in the past that they can reunify with, and they certainly don't want conflict. So that's the tightrope that they walk.
I mean, to that as well, something that you say that I don't really see mentioned that often is sort of how difficult it is to be Taiwanese. Sort of the being a country but not a country, like being important to the world's economy but not so important that anyone recognizes you as a state, and this sort of the mind games that must play on you, and sort of figuring out who you are and what you are and where you belong to.
Indeed. I mean, when you go abroad, you go with the passport. It now, I think, has Taiwan on it. It used to just have the Republic of China. It's not uncommon for immigration officials to not have a clue what this document is, but I think that's improved a bit. But when you go to China, many Taiwanese do go to China, they have business or family or other links there. You can't use that passport. You have to go through a, kind of different route to foreigners. You use a different document, which the Chinese government issues. And so it's this sort of constant game that you have to play, pretending you are not what you are, which most of us aren't familiar with. Indeed, kind of Taiwan has I think a more of a sort of recognition now, and that's good. I mean, people know about Taiwan, but I think there's still a sort of widespread ignorance about, okay, what is this problem and why is it still a problem? Why hasn't it been resolved? And that's really why I wrote the book, to sort of give a relatively straightforward account. People can get somewhat obsessive about this issue. I noticed I put up something on social media the other day and I made some comment, because when you're talking, you have to abbreviate things. You can't get everything absolutely right. And, this person got greatly exercised by some slight misuse of a word and, kind of sent a long sort of detailed explanation, which kind of is answered in the book. I didn't want something that kind of would alienate a general reader by going into deep detail. But obviously, for those who really specialise in this area, and there are some excellent, specialists. I mean, there's plenty of material about this issue that you can look up, and I've referred to some of it in the book. That shows it is a complicated issue, and you can get lost in the thickets quickly. So it's a bit of a balance, but I think it's better for people to have some awareness of this issue rather than know nothing at all. And that's why I dared to write the book, even though I'm sure there are many specialists who would say, well, you could have done more on this or more on that. But I didn't want the readers to stay with me, so hopefully that's what I've achieved.
Well, I mean, so, I follow foreign affairs. I was sort of aware of the situation with Taiwan and the history, but reading your book kind of brought home to me the Taiwan-China situation. It's almost disarmingly quiet, or disarmingly reassuring, that you think there isn't a lot of sort of high-level diplomacy or crisis talks that you might get with, say, Israel and Gaza or Russia and Ukraine. And yeah, it's kind of similar to, I guess, the geography, but it's almost like an earthquake waiting to happen. And it would be a very bad earthquake, and it can happen. But because everything seems sort of a bit placid, aside from, say, the occasional Chinese war games like we're seeing today. But you just think, it's both sides kind of know that, like, there isn't much value to it, so there isn't much reason to get worried. But reading your book, it was like, actually, there's quite a lot to worry about.
That's a good description, Aaron. I mean, I think, there's no actual conflict like there is with Russia-Ukraine. I mean, the Russian war on Ukraine, or the Israeli, action against Gaza, and, there's no fatalities, thank goodness. But I think you're right. Your reading is correct. I mean, this is the ultimate tinderbox. I mean, for all sorts of reasons: human, economic, geopolitical. I mean, were we to see an outbreak of conflict between China and Taiwan, the world would be different in a way that I think would be very, very profound. It would be a different sort of world we would be living in, where all of the hawks about China, who so far don't have the killer fact. I mean, they're waiting for China to do something that proves that it's a malign, malevolent, force. And so far, it's all still a little bit ambiguous. I mean, China's done things big powers do, but it's still not kind of deployed its troops in an aggressive way beyond its borders. I mean, it's sort of doing skirmishes through proxies in the South and East China Sea and all that sort of stuff. And, but it's still not given everyone the solid piece of evidence. So were it to do something on Taiwan, I mean, a really sustained blockade or worse, that would be, the moment when suddenly the hawks would be winning the argument. And that would be a very different world, because then the most aggressive policy towards China would then be necessary and validated. So, that's just one kind of example of how anything that happens between China and Taiwan will have seismic implications in a way that I don't think there's many other issues remotely like this. I think this is a uniquely dangerous issue, but you're absolutely right. It's eerie when you go to Taiwan. You kind of see people just living as they want to live. It's a very liberal and free society, very kind of calm, quite often very relaxed. You don't really see, military around, and yet, of course, that this sits in a very precarious place, and at any moment things could change for the worse. So that is disconcerting. You're absolutely right.
Someone who's fascinated me for a while is Tsai Ing-wen, who was president from 2016 until early this year. And you talk in the book about how she sort of skillfully managed an increasingly belligerent China and also a schizophrenic United States. I wondered if you could sort of explain more about how she did that.
Yeah, you could kind of argue in some ways that she had luck in as much as China's actions in Hong Kong and then its behaviour elsewhere made it easier for her to look like she was defending Taiwan, because all she had to do was just criticise China and she was doing a good job. But I mean, I think it's important to recognise that in her 8 years, she didn't get sucked too much into being used by America as a sort of way of hitting back at China. She avoided that relatively well. And she managed to sort of stop more assertive people in her own party from, doing very adventurous things. That's also a danger. So as a Taiwan president, you've got to look at the outside and the inside as sources of danger. I think her successor, a man called William Lai Ching-te, well, it's early days. His popularity has already sunk, but then so did Tsai Ing-wen's when she was in power for a while. I mean, most people in Taiwan are focused on the economy and, daily life, so he hasn't really improved things greatly there. On China policy, it doesn't seem like he's as competent as he was. So with the new administration in the United States under Trump coming in, we're kind of, I think, in for some turbulence, and it just is a question of how turbulent that turbulence gets.
Well, I mean, the justification China's given for the war games at the moment is his visit to Hawaii and Guam. And so I was curious about how you imagine he might do with handling Trump compared to how Tsai Ing-wen handled Trump.
I think that he's likely to be more disposed to play to Trump's worse side rather than Tsai Ing-wen, who at least tried to, I suppose, be just prudent and moderate. I mean, these are boring qualities that I presume Trump won't be much interested in. I mean, for William Lai Ching-te, he shouldn't forget, though, that Trump is a transactional, value-free person who wants a deal wherever he goes. So, he's made some sort of bellicose noises about the semiconductor industry in Taiwan and how that needs to move elsewhere. It's not going to be some sort of plain sailing no matter what. William Lai Ching-te is not at all experienced diplomatically, so we don't know how he's going to manage this. But I mean, what he mustn't do is to sort of try and play America against China. I mean, that's never going to go well, because of the worst case scenario, China will bite and America will bite, and then we have the scenario that we want to avoid. But even so, you don't want to make America feel that it's being played, and you don't want China to feel that you're playing America against it. So I think he's got to avoid that, and it's not entirely clear with this visit to Hawaii and Guam that that's what he's trying to do. He's been described by one diplomat I met recently from the 8 region as a very stubborn person. I mean, stubbornness sometimes can be valuable, but it also needs flexibility, and that's what Tsai had. I don't know whether he has it.
On the point of transaction, there was a story in the FT just after Trump's election about how the headline was, and what was the gulf between the headline and the content? The headline was sort of Taiwan considering placing a huge weapons order. But then the actual article was mostly unnamed former Trump Pentagon officials saying that Taiwan is considering this, as opposed to anyone in the Taiwanese government actually saying that they were doing this.
Yeah, there's no area, I think, in global politics more prone to sort of a chasm between what people say and what they do than this. I mean, everyone is saying things. China is, Taiwan is, America is saying things, but their actions are very different. From their actions, I mean, for sure, America will support technology sales for weaponry to Taiwan. It might support an increase. In the end, though, if it were to kind of support the kind of increase Taiwan would need to truly be a valid opponent against China, that would be colossal. And I don't think that would cut against, kind of America sort of, saying that well, first of all, although it might be commercially something of interest to America, it would cut across its sort of business interest in China, which it still has. So that balance is something we have to remember. And also, I mean, the kind of the things that Taiwan would need to really make it secure are diplomatic. They're not military. I mean, what it needs is some kind of recognition from China that it can exist in the form that it is at the moment. That would be its security guarantor, not masses and masses of hard kit that it might or might not never use. And if it did use, that wouldn't be a great thing, because then we'd be in the conflagration that would unravel everything. So these people in the sort of Washington at the moment who are speaking, well, we'll just have to watch actions when we go into this new administration, and that will be key, what they do rather than what they say.
I mean, I got the vibe from the story that it was almost like nice, undefended island. You've got the shame if something happened to it. That was the impression I got from that story.
Indeed. I mean, because America will look after its own interests, and its own interests are not necessarily those of Taiwan. I mean, and Trump is not ideological. I mean, he's made it pretty clear this weekend he's not interested in America getting involved in the situation in Syria, and that might be right, it might not, but I mean, there would have to be... He's not an American president who is remotely interested in getting involved in the problems of others, and I don't really see why China and Taiwan doesn't figure in that kind of framework. I mean, business reasons, he would want to probably take notice, but China is a way bigger business proposal than Taiwan, and so you have to read from that what you can about how likely he is to really, really step in if this did escalate.
And he's made no secret of how much he admires Xi Xinping.
Indeed, a very handsome man, I think he said. He called him. And I think he
is a good-looking man.
Well, I mean, better looking than Trump. I mean, that's for sure. But that's probably not something that we need to dwell on. I mean, I don't know. Trump is likely to be is probably obsessed by China. Let's face it, which is probably good. I mean, an American president is thinking 99% of the time about China rather than anywhere else. They probably need to do that, Well, he might do something extraordinary. I mean, he's not a very easily to predict person, but the costs, if he gets it wrong in this particular area, are staggering. So let's hope his famous gut instincts are right, because if they're not, we all have a problem.
I mean, there's a chapter towards the end of your book where you outline a scenario in which China and the United States come to blows over Taiwan. And it sort of starts off with an increasingly radical Republican Party sort of eager to take a stand against Beijing, wins big in the 2024 election and ignores diplomatic advice and recognizes Taiwan as a state. And so I was wondering how you feel about that scenario now.
Well, the point in the book, and it's still true, is that I once would have thought this scenario was, impossible and in the realms of fantasy. And now I still think it's highly unlikely, but it's less unlikely than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. And that's not the right direction to be travelling in, right? We're creeping closer and closer to this eventuality maybe being possible. The Secretary of State in the first Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, did recognise Taiwan on his last day in office as a sort of, kind of gesture, I suppose. However, that was ignored because it was his last day in office and there was nothing he could do about it. He is not coming back, apparently, into this administration. That's probably a good thing because he got more and more flaky, and he has, kind of really become almost zealous about this issue for one reason or another, that China is the great Satan, that, we need to kind of take this down. And I think he's quite extreme. But the point is that people like him are closer to power now than they've ever been before. That is concerning. So that's why I wrote that somewhat outlandish scenario in the book, but I don't think it seems that outlandish now compared to how crazy it would have been even 10, 15 years ago.
I mean, your Senator Brownlow sort of gave me J.D. Vance vibes.
Indeed, and that was before I knew about this delightful character called J.D. Vance. And I mean, China, American politics now is very performative. I mean, it's all about performance and spectacle. Is it Guy Debord, in The Situationists in the 1960s, talked about the society of the spectacle. The spectacle is all that matters. And, you look at the whole performance of this Trump administration, it's likely to be a performance. And, we have the Taiwan episode, the episode about Taiwan where, J.D. Vance says, gee, let's kind of, let's stick it to the Chinese by recognizing Taiwan and see what happens. But then reality kicks in. And, I think reality will be very bitter and very, 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 very unpalatable in this situation. I suspect, we're all living in a bit of a swoon at the moment where we literally look at this performance and we think, okay, maybe they know what they're doing. But, really smart, really good people have dealt with Russia, Ukraine, with China, Taiwan, with Israel and Gaza. And I don't really see how these are going to be resolved with just someone coming along and magically, kind of clicking their fingers. I'd like to believe it. If they do it, I will eat humble pie. If the violence stops, what's not to like? But I'm a realist too. And I don't know. I would have thought if these things could have been done, they would have been done before. And I feel that, what's more likely is that Trump too is going to lead to some very big disillusionment in America. And frustration and anger, and that might make things way worse. And that's why Senator Brownlow, as he's called in the book, or J.D. Vance, as you want to call him, reality, might well become a reality because they will be looking for scapegoats, and China will be the thing that really triggers them. So not maybe under Trump, but under whoever comes after him, I think this issue becomes more and more urgent and difficult.
I did see a great tweet, and by great I mean slightly terrifying, where I think it was an excerpt from an interview with Vance, and he said after the assassination attempt on Trump, he went into flight or fight mode and rushed home and sort of got ready for civil war, and someone sort of commented that that's exactly the temperament that you want in the Situation Room, dealing with international crises. Oh.
Indeed. It's going to be reality TV writ big, right? And like I say, reality TV is something you can switch on and off, but the Taiwan-China question is not something you can switch on and off. So that's where I stand.
A story I love is about Colonel Richelieu having a conference with his generals about a military operation, and sort of one of them confidently points his finger at a river on a map and says, we'll cross here. And Richelieu apparently said, if only your finger was a bridge. And I guess it's quite easy, say, looking at a map, at how China might overwhelm Taiwan. But a point you make in the book is that militarily it wouldn't be a simple undertaking, and probably one of the most difficult military operations since like D-Day.
Yeah, I got some technical advice from a current student who knows about these things, and an amphibious landing would be one hell of an enterprise. So, the point in the book is not about whatever military things happen, it's what happens afterwards. You've got 23 million people on the island who do not recognise and will not recognise an aggressive takeover. I don't know how you deal with that. I mean, winning the war is one thing, but we have learned from bitter experience quite recently, winning the victory is way harder.
I guess that sort of leads to, well, I guess your overall argument in the book, which is like the value of ambiguity, and sort of swearing off these attempts, I guess, to resolve the issue. And reading the book, you allude to it, but one of my favorite books is Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, and the sense of urgency that sort of developed in the early 1900s about the time somehow slipping away and sort of the need to sort things as soon as possible. That sort of rhetoric creeping into Taiwan and China, and how everyone's time frames seem to be shortening, but for no real reason other than they say that time frames are shortening. And sort of your argument is that we need to sort of step back from that and take value in, I guess, the old one China policy of just not making a resolution one way or the other, but just seeing what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a radical argument, but these days an argument like this does seem a bit radical, which is just leave it. Because all of the sides are no closer. In fact, two of the sides, China and Taiwan, are getting further apart. So there's no middle point really, and the United States is definitely itself not stable. I mean, there's nothing good about a situation where the three key parties are not stable. Then there's very little control over whatever outcome any one of them might go for. If you've got all three of them going in a different direction, well, then that's not going to be great, right? So I think, the book is just a reminder, in a sense, that there is this framework that has worked in a very unsatisfying and scrappy way, but it's worked. And although Western policymakers might want to come in and get this thing called closure or resolution, we're in the business of management now. I mean, there's no such thing as closure or resolution. I mean, we just manage day by day to just keep things going. Things change slowly over time. As I said, the key things in this problem are identity and sovereignty. Well, I mean, they've changed a lot in the last 40 years in China and Taiwan. They'll probably change in the future. At the moment, China's insistence on sovereignty, well, it's sort of quite pure. But views on sovereignty can change. China's also been flexible on sovereignty. It was initially about Hong Kong. And Taiwan and its views of identity have changed. So we have to wait for change, but it won't come dramatically. It will come step by step, and it will take a long time. Maybe then we will have a situation which is more benign, but not at the moment.
I mean, you've alluded to this before, but again, it's very easy, sort of, I guess, analysing international affairs of sort of imagining the worst case scenarios and the trends that sort of point at that. But I always think that something that's undervalued is surprise. And so I'm sort of wondering do you think there's any potential for, say, Trump or Xi Jinping to surprise everyone in a good way, and somehow sort of get to a better position with Taiwan?
Well, the idealist in me, or the optimist, sort of says, okay, with a gambler and a bit of a gamester like Trump and a man with sort of like his massive ambitions like Xi, I suppose you do have the possibility of them sitting in a room and doing a deal. I mean, it's possible. Whether it's a good deal and whether it's a deal that will stick, those are separate questions. But yeah, I mean, there's a possibility they will give a surprise. And there's a possibility, although it's slightly more narrow, that it will be a good surprise. I mean, I think this whole situation is one where both China and Taiwan have proved in the last half century that they can give big surprises. I mean, Taiwan becoming a democracy is a big surprise. It wasn't expected in the 80s. The early 80s, no one thought it was going to happen. It's happened. It's happened successfully. China implementing massive economic changes, not even expected in, 77, 78, after Mao Zedong died. Now today, look at it, it's more capitalist than capitalist countries. So these are two partners that can definitely deliver surprise. But the key word that you just used is good surprise. We don't want a bad surprise, we want a good surprise.
Professor Brown, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Kerry Brown again for sparing the time to talk to me. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like, rate, comment. If you want to buy the Taiwan Story or any of Kerry's other books, visit the Strategy Hour and Bookshop page. The link is in the show notes. Next week will be the show's Christmas finale, and I have such a good show lined up. Hope you all tune in for it.